I'm Gabriele Magro, and this is Paris Calling. Today, Karol Noroña, Quito, Ecuador.
Por eso es que en la ciudad no se sentía tanto, por eso es que tú escuchas a alguien de Quito.
These days, if you talk to someone from Quito, you will hear things like Ecuador was an island of peace and everything was fine. Of course, because they weren't living in those border areas. And in fact, the shock of my exile and what was terrible for me is that they threatened to kill me and tried to carry out an attack against me precisely in Quito, in my city, the city that was supposedly the safest.
En la ciudad que en teoría era la más segura.
Journalist Karol Noroña spoke to us from her hometown, Ecuador's capital, where she returned in June of 2024 after spending more than a year in exile because of death threats from the leaders of one of Ecuador's most powerful cartels, Los Lobos. The biographical events of Noroña's life are deeply intertwined with the internal transformations that have shaken the small South American nation in recent years. In 2017, Ecuador had a homicide rate of around 6 per 100,000 inhabitants. By 2023, that figure had risen to 46, with more than 8,000 murders in a single year, almost double the murder rate of Mexico and Colombia. In just 6 years, the country went from being one of the safest in Latin America to the most violent in the region. If we had to look for a beginning to the spiral of violence that has engulfed Ecuador in recent years, and at the same time a crossroads in Noroña's life, it would be April 2018. That month, the country was jolted by the kidnap and murder of 3 journalists from El Comercio, the newspaper where Noroña was working at the time. Reporter Javier Ortega, photographer Paul Rivas, and driver Efraín Segarra, who had traveled to the northern border to cover the rising tensions after a series of attacks on police and military posts, were targeted by the Oliver Sinisterra Front, a dissident faction of the Colombian rebel group FARC. Their deaths became a turning point for Ecuador, erasing the image of the country as an island of peace and exposed the reality of organized crime, drug trafficking, and porous borders. For Noroña, it was more than a turning point. It was also a calling.
It left its mark on many of us. At the time, I was doing cultural journalism. I always wanted to cover what I eventually did cover, but I was still at the beginning of my career. But after my colleagues were killed, I decided to direct all my work toward understanding violence in Ecuador. So, I think this tragedy has 2 sides. On the one hand, it was devastating, very disheartening for the country, and it made us grasp a bit of what was coming in the following years, even though we did not take precautions and the state did not take measures in response. But on the other hand, our boys also left a legacy. Many of us journalists who lived through that decided to dedicate our work to understanding violence in the country, to understand what was going on, because that was our pressing question. What happened? What really occurred?
Ecuador, a country of 18 million, sits wedged between 2 significantly larger and economically stronger neighbors. Colombia to the north, the world's largest producer of cocaine, with a GDP more than 3 times the size of Ecuador, and Peru to the south, another major source of narcotics trafficking, with an economy roughly twice as big. As Colombian and Mexican cartels fought over control of the routes to the Pacific and access to Ecuador's busy ports, local gangs like the Choneros and their splinter group, the Lobos, were drawn into the struggle. What began as a fight over transit points and shipping lanes spiraled into what often feels like a civil war.
A ver, yo creo que hay que partir de la idea de
I think we need to start from the idea that Ecuador was usually seen from the outside as an island of peace, right? That's why people always ask, how did this island of peace turn into one of the epicenters of organized crime on a global scale? But I believe that although we had certain historic turning points starting in 2018, especially with attacks and later the prison massacres, the violence was already there, just less visible, contained above all in the border areas.
We ask Noroña whether such a sudden explosion of conflict between the gangs and the state implies what some analysts suggest, namely that until 2018, internal order in the country was maintained through a series of informal agreements between institutions and criminal groups, what some have called a pax mafiosa.
People often talk about leftist President Rafael Correa's government as one of the peaks of the so-called mafia peace. There's no doubt that there has been collusion on all levels. Reporting and security experts agree on that. But the collusion likely preceded Correa. Plus, I don't think organized crime is disputing territory with the state. I think organized crime in many cases works with and within the state. I don't believe organized crime wants to displace the state. What I think is that it wants to work with it because in the end, the state is an infrastructure too.
Western media began to notice that something was changing in Ecuador when news of the brutal prison massacres reached beyond the country's borders. In February 2021, clashes inside Guayaquil's prison left 79 inmates dead. Later that year, another wave of killings in the same prison claimed the lives of more than 100 prisoners. They were the first of many such cases. Between 2018 and 2023, a staggering 680 people were murdered inside Ecuadorian prisons. On this point too, Noroña, who has dedicated years of her career and immense effort to covering Ecuador's prison system, is unequivocal. This development was only possible because gangs had long been using the penitentiaries as hubs to recruit new members and run their operations with a troubling degree of police complicity. Noroña saw in the massacres the proof of a corrupt system, and one particularly unsettling trait, the dehumanization of inmates. She started covering the situation before a public opinion that largely shrugged off the news with the attitude of good riddance if they kill each other.
For me, it was also very important to tell the stories of these human beings. Who were they? What was their relationship with their mothers like? The massacre that came after the one in September, the one on November 12 and 13, was brutal. A prisoner sent me an audio message telling me to please send law enforcement because they were going to be killed. That day, some inmates did a short live broadcast that 14,000 of us watched between midnight and 1 in the morning. And the prisoners said, "We leave this video as proof that they knew what was going to happen, and they let us die." 68 people were in fact killed in that massacre.
Noroña believes violence cannot be justified, but it can be explained. And to understand it, she says, you have to go back to its societal roots.
When I began covering the prison massacres, there were many young men who were imprisoned and who, in my view, did not need prison but rather access to a rehabilitation program, above all for their health. And it struck me deeply how incarceration shatters you. I have been deeply affected, for example, by talking to a hitman, 16 years of age, who would not hesitate to shoot me in the head, or you. He would kill us for money any day. But at the same time, he was saving the money he earns from killing people to give to his grandmother, who is raising his other siblings. Take this other boy, for example, the one I mentioned who sent me the audio before being killed in the massacre. He was addicted to a drug called H in Ecuador, which is a mix of heroin and rat poison. It is terrible, one of the cheapest, but also one of the most harmful. And this boy, he had no money. But little by little, he was rehabilitating himself in prison. What he wanted was to get out and live with his mother. He told me he was in love with a girl and things like that. Sometimes you become the only contact a person has. And so when he was killed in the prison massacre, I was very angry as well. My statements at the time were very strong. It just feels like these lives do not matter to institutions. But these lives matter.
Porque estas vidas no les importan. Estas vidas importan.
Ecuador's young populist president Daniel Noboa, elected in late 2023, was only weeks into his term when armed men stormed the studios of TC Televisión in the country's largest city, Guayaquil, forcing anchors to the ground at gunpoint. The unprecedented attack, broadcast in real time, became the most shocking symbol of a country losing control to organized crime. Noboa immediately invoked a state of emergency and eventually went further, declaring an internal armed conflict against dozens of criminal groups, effectively labeling them military enemies of the state.
Para mí fue como un tema mucho más narrativo y evidentemente.
It was little more than storytelling. And clearly people in Ecuador right now are willing to give up their rights, to surrender their rights out of fear, which is ultimately the internal goal of any war. It was a narrative that has not solved problems, because 2025 is going to become the most violent year in the country. I guarantee it. I guarantee that will happen. And on the other hand, it has also triggered a surge in human rights violations, torture, extrajudicial executions, and abuses of power.
Ejecuciones extrajudiciales, extralimitaciones.
In the meantime, the conflict, once thought to be confined to the distant border provinces, was creeping closer to Quito.
O sea, en realidad, por ejemplo, si tú analizas.
I mean, in reality, for example, if you look at Quito, yes, Quito as the capital is much safer. You cannot compare the violence in Quito with the violence in Esmeraldas or Duran or Manta or the Amazon border regions. In those areas, there was always violence. And so it felt like a local issue of border areas. And that's why in the capital, people lived as if it didn't affect them. How could that happen? What has happened in Quito, especially since the declaration of the internal armed conflict, is that as provinces like Esmeraldas, Manabí, and Guayas were militarized, and there was a lot of displacement, that not only forced internal displacement of victims, but also displacement of the criminal organizations themselves. So in Quito, you never imagine seeing things like recruitment by criminal gangs, for example. But now it's happening. When you tell people that in Quito children and teenagers are being recruited, they can't believe it. They still think violence is still contained in those areas with high numbers of deaths. Of course, if you look at Quito's homicide rate, it is much lower than the national average. But that is due to Quito's nature. It is the capital and it is located in the highlands. Precisely for this reason, what has happened is that these criminal organizations have been relocating to Quito because they see it as a refuge. We weren't used to seeing trucks filled with rifles or contract killings.
And that's what would ultimately lead to Noroña's forced exile. Her reporting on the prison massacres and the rise of organized crime had made the journalist a target. The death threats began to multiply.
A ver, yo durante los últimos meses había publicado algunos temas.
I had published some pieces denouncing the gang called Los Lobos, and they didn't like them because they thought I was on their side. They believed such a thing because I was questioning the privileges given to the choneros, their enemies. Obviously, they don't understand how journalism works. When they realized I didn't have any preference for one criminal organization over another, that angered them a lot. One day, I published a piece naming several of their leaders. When I released that article, I felt a bit uneasy, but thought, well, I'll wait to see what happens. Nothing happened at first. A few days later, though, my Twitter account was hacked. I don't attribute that to the gangs. Gangs don't say, let's hack her ex account. But I knew something was off. I had many open fronts at that time, because I was also investigating the police. That happened on a Wednesday, and that same Wednesday night, a source from prison alerted me and said, "Be careful, I've heard inmates mentioning your name." And he added, "They're trying to find out who has been giving you information. Please protect yourself." Then on Thursday night, another source, totally unrelated to the first, wrote to me saying, "I need to meet with you now. I really need to meet with you, right now." When I met that source, they showed me chats from another leader of Lobos, and I saw messages saying, "This fucking bitch has gone too far." They had my photos, they had audio recordings, they had all my data. There were voice notes describing how they were going to attack me outside my house. At first, I was in shock, of course. I ran out of there. I didn't go back home. I hesitated about whether to tell my editors because I thought maybe if I didn't say anything, nothing would happen. It's a question I've asked myself so many times over the years. What if I had just stepped back from that coverage for a while? Maybe nothing would have happened. I've always asked myself that.
Capaz no pasaba nada. Siempre me he hecho esa pregunta.
In March 2023, with the support of international networks for at-risk journalists, she left the country on a day's notice and moved to an undisclosed location abroad. She could not even say goodbye to her family in person. We asked Noroña what it all felt like, if she felt any relief, how she experienced exile, and how hard it was to live through the silence and loneliness that followed.
Yo nunca quise irme.
I never wanted to go. I refused at first, but I think it was the best decision at that moment. I couldn't even say goodbye to my parents. I told them I was leaving the country on a video call. For them, it was like a bombshell to hear that. Even though they knew I was investigating security issues, they never imagined this would happen. They didn't read my work. In my mind, I always wanted to return to the country, and that's why I decided to remain silent for a while. Because I thought, if I want to come back, I need to lower the risk. And that's what I did. But it was, I don't know how to explain it. I wasn't exactly terrified, I was lost. I thought my career was over. That was the hardest emotional break for me. People were speaking about me as if I were dead. For the first few months, I didn't read anything about me. But later, I saw what people were writing, what they sent me, and it looked as if I were dead, as if I no longer existed, as if I had been silenced forever, as if all my dreams had been taken from me. At first, it was very, very painful. But in the end, I think my victory has been returning to the country. And my victory has also been not getting back to journalism out of hatred. I don't hold grudges against those who wanted to kill me. Instead, I have tried to understand what their lives were like.
He intentado entender cómo fueron sus vidas.
After several attempts to come back, Noroña finally returned to Quito to present her book of reportages on violence in Ecuador, Ausencias, in June 2024. It was during that visit that she made the decision to stay.
Intenté 3 veces volver a Ecuador.
I tried to return to Ecuador 3 times, and I finally decided I could stay when I came back to launch the book. I told everyone not to say I was going to stay, but my thinking was, if I don't try that out, then I'll have to remain in exile indefinitely. But the launch of that book was very beautiful. I invited the families who were protagonists of those stories, the mothers of victims of prison massacres, victims of femicides, and desaparecidos. And it was so moving because I think, in the end, within all the deep wounds that mark Ecuador, something you can still see in the context of violence, and something I firmly believe in, is the weaving of community bonds, of community care. When you see the militarization of the country, it feels as if not only security is militarized, but also affections, tenderness, the everyday things. Everything becomes much harder to sustain. And I think that the challenge here in Ecuador is how to find hope in those contexts. One of the practices we found is being able to tell the stories, to weave those stories, to come together as a community. So it was very beautiful, really one of the most beautiful moments, because when I had to leave, I realized the people who supported me the most and spoke out for me were the families I had written about. Journalism is not well paid. Of course, it's terrible. Sometimes you wonder how you'll keep going because the work is so precarious. But I think there are other rewards, like knowing that there are people who trust you with things, who believe your life is worth protecting. That is also why you write. I think one of the most beautiful gifts this profession has given me is the chance to have more than one family. Souls that never wanted to be protagonists of these stories, who would have given anything not to be the parents of a murdered child. And yet they, despite all the pain, have taught me so much about the value of justice. Sometimes they tell me, we don't even want prison. What we want is for people to say who our children really were, to apologize, to acknowledge that this should never have happened. I have always said that journalism saved my life, and I feel it's still saving me. I am profoundly in love with journalism that was not taken from me. That's why I believe that at one point a colleague, Marcela Turati, who is Mexican, told me, right now you don't understand, but for you this exile will be a victory. And I thought, how dare she tell me that being exiled in another country is a victory? I couldn't understand it. But later she told me, one day you will remember what I said. And indeed, for me, coming back, even though it has been very complicated, very difficult, and sometimes I ask myself why I return and continuing to write has been a victory. They did not defeat us. Even when they have killed journalists, they have not defeated us.
Seguir escribiendo ha sido una victoria. No nos ganaron. E incluso cuando han matado a periodistas, no nos han ganado.
Paris Calling is a Work Crunch podcast. Post-production is done by Jacob Shropshire. Interview and narration is by me, Gabriele Magro. Editing by Jeff Israeli. Creative assistance is by Rebecca Bonfius and Gabrielle Nadler. Credit to Migfus20 on Free Sound and Alban Goch on Pixabay for music used in this production. Voice matching software was used in the creation of English language audio. With each episode of Paris Calling, we discover someone else, somewhere else. Support Paris Calling with likes, shares, and ratings on your favorite platforms.